Hi, it's Heather. This month's episode swap is from the Arnemancy podcast, hosted by Reverend Erik L. Arneson, who talks all things tarot, hermeticism, and occult philosophy. This excerpt is from a 9-part series on one of the best-known texts in Western occultism, the 3 books of occult philosophy. It was written by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa and first published in what is today Germany in 1531. Now, if some of the topics are over your head, don't worry. Erik's got you covered. He's got tons of great links and resources on his website, arnemancy.com. So enjoy.
Sometime between 1506 and 1509, a young Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa visited the renowned and possibly infamous Johannes Trithemius in Würzburg. The abbot was a learned scholar, and he had already developed a reputation that had caused him some trouble. Just a few years earlier, he had been forced to resign from his position as the abbot of Sponheim Abbey because of his reputation as a magician and occultist. Agrippa was in his early 20s at the time, and he was working on a project that he was excited to share with the abbot. They spoke about chemistry, magic, Kabbalah, and things cloaked in secrecy, about hidden sciences and arts, and that most mysterious of sciences, magic. Agrippa was presenting his mentor with a manuscript of De Occulta Philosophia Libri Tres, a book that would change the world. It covered topics ranging from the natural world to the divine mind, from medicine to astronomy to magic to astrology. This book possibly contained Agrippa's entire philosophy and worldview, aspects of his life that had probably been heavily influenced by Trithemius. But why was this book so influential 500 years later? Welcome to the first episode in a series that will be exploring the content, message, and ongoing influence of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's magnum opus, De Occulta Philosophia Libri Tres, better known in the modern world as 3 books of occult philosophy. Join me as I talk to experts, translators, historians, and magicians to unravel the secret of this book of secrets, as we figure out not only where this important book came from, but why it had such a lasting impact on the world. If we want to understand the 3 books of occult philosophy, we first need to take a look at the world in which Agrippa lived. We will start by looking at the Holy Roman Empire, where Agrippa was born and spent a good chunk of his life. By Agrippa's time, the Holy Roman Empire was a mess. Imperial authority was weak and poorly executed, with the real power in the empire in the governments of territorial states and independent cities. And there were a lot of those. The Holy Roman Empire was composed of hundreds of duchies, bishoprics, counties, margraviates, and independent cities. There were even a few republics, and of course, the very important electorates. Though its borders tended to shift, in general, the Holy Roman Empire during Agrippa's life included what we know today as Germany, Poland, Switzerland, parts of France, Austria, and northern Italy. Now, one became the Holy Roman Emperor by first being elected King of the Romans by the 7 prince-electors of the empire, none of whom lived in or near Rome. Once an individual was elected King of the Romans, it was usually only a matter of time before he was coronated by the Pope, which would officially make him the Holy Roman Emperor. So Frederick III was the Holy Roman Emperor from 1440 to 1493, and his long reign was seen as one that was extremely ineffectual at addressing many of the problems the empire faced. His son, Maximilian I, assumed the throne after Frederick's death in 1493. Maximilian's arrival on the throne was greeted with excitement and anticipation. So Agrippa served under Maximilian I a couple times, first as secretary and then as a soldier, at one point even becoming a knight. After Maximilian I's death, his grandson succeeded him as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519 and became Emperor Charles V. He was already King Charles I of Spain, and as the head of the House of Habsburgs, he ruled over a vast territory that included the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, Spain, Burgundy, Sicily, Naples, and even the Spanish colonies in the Americas. Charles V was ambitious and intelligent. He picked up a number of languages over the period of his reign and supposedly once quipped, "I speak Latin to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse." Okay, now let's talk about the Renaissance, starting with the Italian Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance, or at least the Italian Renaissance with which we are concerned, began roughly during the lifetime of Cosimo de' Medici, a great patron of the arts in Florence during the 15th century. Amazing works of art, philosophy, and science came out of this period. It brought us such visionaries as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Machiavelli, Boccaccio, Raphael, and many more. Even more importantly, the influence of the Italian Renaissance was felt across Europe. However, the Italian Renaissance didn't last forever. In 1527, Emperor Charles V invaded the Papal States in central Italy after Pope Clement VII teamed up with the French, who were Charles's arch-nemeses. In the aftermath of this invasion, mutinous troops from the army of the Holy Roman Empire, upset at not getting paid, sacked Rome. Churches, monasteries, and palaces were looted and destroyed. This tragic event, known today as the Sack of Rome, is often said to have been the end of the Italian Renaissance. So between the time of the manuscript of the occult philosophy that Trithemius received and the finished version of occult philosophy being published, Western Christianity experienced perhaps its most significant change of the past millennium, the Protestant Reformation. On October 31st, 1517, a month and a half after Agrippa's 31st birthday, Martin Luther made his 95 Theses known. This was the beginning of a huge wave of changes for the Christian world. Now, looking back at the Reformation after 500 years, it kind of looks like there were just two religions in 16th century Europe, Catholic and Protestant. But this really wasn't so. The Protestants were fractured and divided, and there were two leaders who came to the forefront, Martin Luther and John Calvin. The governing classes tend to like Lutheranism because it freed them from papal interference. Meanwhile, Calvinism upended the political order and made laymen more important than the priests. So most importantly, the Reformation set both the Protestants and the eventual Catholic Counter-Reformation in a position where strict Christianity seemed to demand the censure of the imaginary and the rejection of the culture of the phantasmic age of the Renaissance. This would result in radical change in Europe's cultural imagination, and one that would have a dire impact on the reception and ongoing influence of occult philosophy. We will cover this topic in greater detail in a later episode of this series. While the Renaissance and Reformation developed side by side, another important development was taking place in Europe: the birth of modern science. This incredibly significant shift will become important when we discuss the lasting impact of Agrippa's work. Hopefully, this review of the state of the Western world during Agrippa's time will help you put in his work in context as we proceed in our deep dive into Agrippa's occult philosophy. A couple years ago, I teamed up with Douglas Batchelor of the What Magic Is This podcast to create 2 podcast episodes exploring Agrippa's work. Here's Doug speaking about the importance of 3 books of occult philosophy.
Well, it was the book. It was the book that put into one place a whole overarching schema for magic itself, and not so much how to do magic, because Agrippa leaves some of those bits out, but when it was finally released, it just changed everything. It was the document that people could point to and say, this is the occult and this is magic. There's something that happens, particularly when occultists talk about Agrippa's 3 books, where they'll say it's like the Bible of magic. And I actually don't agree with that at all. I think if there is a better comparison that can be had, I think it could relate to something like St. Augustine's The City of God. And if people are unaware of this book, I'll just give a very short summary. But it was about 14 books, and they were written in I believe, the 5th century. And what Augustine does in these books is that he basically lays out what good and evil is, what people should do as far as how they live their lives. And in this respect, it was how people should live their lives in service to God. And everything from government organizations should be in service of religion, and how people get their knowledge should be from a belief in God first, and a Christian God specifically. But what this did, and people don't realize this, and it's a bit of a pity that this book isn't taught more than it is, The City of God by St. Augustine of Hippo, is that for 1,000 years, this was the cornerstone of Western thought before the Enlightenment. And it's tough for us to think of a time because since the Enlightenment, we have our ideas of, we get our knowledge not from belief, but our belief from knowledge. So 1,000 years, this book was how people saw the world and lived their lives as a service to God. So the reason I bring this up as the book that I compare 3 books to is that, for better or worse, we are living in the shadow of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. For anybody that is interested in the occult, it has such an overarching theses that Agrippa himself, almost single-handedly, although we might talk about how he had a bit of help, but he based his magic and his understandings of the occult on a Neoplatonic, Kabbalistic division of 3 worlds, which would be the elementary, the celestial, and the religious, that, since it was published, was basically what most people viewed as being magic, which is really kind of crazy because Agrippa, being as smart as he was and as crafty as he was, that was the thing that people, as I mentioned earlier, could just say, this is the occult, which has its downsides as well, but it also has its upsides. But for the most part, whether you don't follow Agrippa or not, you have to acknowledge that it is Agrippa's world. And particularly with the promulgation of so let's say, lodge-based magic, things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, who, through a combination of taking from Agrippa, but also Francis Barrett, crafted what they saw the occult as, which became the idea of how modern magic is practiced now. But we forget that Agrippa was very much of his time, and the things that he did are so much Agrippa that I think nowadays we kind of have to take a step back and see the context in which how Agrippa came to these conclusions and what his influences were. And so these modern translations that we're starting to get of the original Latin into English are really quite helpful, particularly Eric Perdue's version of the 3 books of occult philosophy, where you can see exactly where Agrippa took his notes from and how he crafted this model of how he saw the occult. And there's things that occur within the 3 books of occult philosophy. Like one of the major ones is that he basically reframes all of ritual magic as a quest for divine truths through religious exercises. And a lot of people think that this is magic proper, which is a bit of a misnomer. I mean, people would have recognized the three books of occult philosophy when it came out, particularly people who had practiced magic and who were operant. They would have recognized some of the elements, particularly from things like the magic from the High Middle Ages. But this whole concept, the Kabbalistic Neoplatonic concept, was very new and quite groundbreaking. And since then, this idea of all ritual magic being a quest for divine truths is one that a lot of people still think is the ultimate point of magic.
As you can see, Occult Philosophy seems like one of those books that everybody interested in Western esotericism should want to read or at least check out. Fortunately for us, today there are 3 different English translations available. The first translation is the oldest. It was translated by somebody named J.F. in 1651. There's still some debate about who this J.F. is. Some people think it was somebody named John Freak. This edition is available online, but if you're looking for a version of J.F.'s translation that is easier to read and follow along with, you are looking for Donald Tyson's edition. He took the J.F. translation, edited it, and annotated it, and it was published by Llewellyn in the early 90s and continues to be in print. Translation number 2 came out in 2020. It was a translation by Paul Summers Young and was published by Black Letter Press. And finally, translation number 3 is by Eric Perdue, and it was published in 2021 by Inner Traditions. So let's talk a little bit about this book. Since this episode is supposed to be an introduction, we should get into its contents, at least an overview. Occult Philosophy is a big book. It is 3 books, in fact, and altogether they total something over 600 pages, typically. The first book is usually called The Natural World. This book includes a number of really important topics, such as Agrippa's definition of magic, a discussion of the classical elements and their qualities, a description of occult correspondences and how divine and celestial bodies are reflected in the natural world. This part of the book is kind of at the core of the occult philosophy, so it's fairly important. This book is also filled with fantastical tales of strange animals and plants, magic stones and creatures. In fact, Book 1 of Occult Philosophy, because of these fantastical tales, can be a real challenge for the modern reader. To better understand its importance, I went to Eric Perdue, whose translation of this monumental work was published, as I said earlier, by Inner Traditions in 2021. In addition to his obvious experience with Agrippa, Eric has studied metaphysics and the occult and has practiced magic and astrology for more than 30 years, with a particular focus on practical folk and astrological magic. Through his lectures and writings on traditional astrology and talismanic magic, he has been a notable voice on the subjects of medieval astrology, traditional magical systems, and, of course, the legacy of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa.
Most importantly, he defines what magic is in the second chapter, which almost no magic book does. Yeah, it's hard for me to describe to people how to approach it, because not everybody who buys magical books really reads them all the way through to begin with. For non-Agrippa books, some people just don't really approach things that way. But I think if you're the type of person who really wants to develop that sort of spiritual worldview, then Agrippa just lays it out just systematically. Ignore the chameleon, ignore the fish, but he talks. He has this amazing description of the qualities of the elements that really no one else has described that I could find as well as him. He, like I said, describes the logic of planetary rulerships. He describes dreams, prophetic dreams and things like that. All these like foundational things that every magician has to know are in that first book. We're all using natural things in ceremonies.
There is much more to explore in Book 1, including material on passions, spirits, frenzy, and one of my favorites, fascination. We will be exploring these topics in detail in an upcoming episode. The second book of Occult Philosophy is titled The Celestial World. This book covers numbers, mathematics, and astrology. It includes material on spirits, the planets, the fixed stars, the celestial spheres. It goes into detail on correspondences between numbers, planets, the planes of reality, gods, spirits, angels, and demons. One of the things that I find fascinating about Book 2 is this huge emphasis on the importance of math and number. In fact, it opens with this: the disciplines of mathematics and the like are so necessary for magic that it is professed that without them, everyone will lose their way. Their work will be frustrated, and they will achieve few desired effects. Here is Eric Perdue again speaking about the importance of numbers in Agrippa's work.
Basically, the number is the foundation for reality to Agrippa. That is the way that astrology works from number. Alphabets are based on mathematical ratios and things like that. There's liturgical numbers for different spirits and planets, things like that. So it's the underlying framework, and the math itself can also describe, certain parts of reality, even pre-modern and Pythagorean, type of mathematics. But I think to Agrippa, the most important thing was the astrology, because the astrology is math, basically. One of the questions that came to mind was, he makes a throwaway statement that numbers are formal. In the JF translation, he says formal, which is a correct translation. But if you say the word formal, it kind of, brings to mind a tuxedo or something. But what they mean is that numbers are part of the realm of the Platonic forms.
Finally, the third book of occult philosophy is titled The Divine World. This book covers the nature of the human soul and discusses our place in the cosmos. It lists hierarchies of gods, spirits, and demons, discusses the importance of ritual purity and secrecy, and contains Agrippa's take on the Kabbalah. When I discussed this book with Eric Perdue, he talked to me about one of the chapters in Book 3 that had a huge impact on him, and I think you should probably hear this. So here's Eric again.
It might be a boring chapter to a lot of people, but one of the ones that fascinated me the most was this chapter on the three parts of the soul, because it was just so elegantly written, and it really describes this, that chain of being that Ficino talks about a lot. It really made me kind of imagine that the chain actually having like a literal chain with links to it, and how you have the top part of one link connecting to the bottom part of the link above it. And the three parts of the soul have that sort of connection to them. So, for instance, if mind is the top part of the soul, well, your mind is actually touching the bottom part of the next level above you. For some reason, I dwelled on that chapter a long time. It really spoke to me. I didn't expect to. It's a purely philosophical chapter.
Now that we've had a 30,000-foot look at occult philosophy, let's talk about what we're going to be doing with the rest of this podcast series. In this episode, we just covered the basics. We did some historical background. We looked at sort of an overview of the three books. But we're going to be getting into a deep dive on a number of topics. In one episode, we're going to discuss Agrippa's various sources for occult philosophy. We're also going to spend an episode talking about the inner senses and the world of fantasy. We're going to be talking about fascination, binding, and the body in occult philosophy. We're also going to do a deep dive into prophecy, dreams, and ritual. And of course, that we are going to be spending some time talking about Agrippa's magic squares and mathematics in Agrippa's occult philosophy. I also have plans to spend one or more episodes going into Agrippa's approach to planetary magic, including an exploration of the planetary intelligences, which are a class of spirit that show up in Agrippa and only a few other places. So that's going to be a really interesting exploration. And then finally, we're going to talk about the occult philosophy's lasting legacy and influence. Where did it go, and what became of it, and where is it now? Before we wrap up this episode, I want to share one more bit from Eric Perdue. I asked him for advice for modern readers of Agrippa. What should they look for, and how should they proceed reading this important book? Here's what he had to say.
I think rather than how, I think why. The issue with modern metaphysics, I think, is that there are a lot of recipe books out there, a lot of books on technique, and not a lot of books on what things are. And in our modern worldview, I mean, all of us are pretty much raised in a materialistic, scientific worldview. Most of us were taught that. And that certainly has a reality to it. But when you're approaching something like magic or astrology, there is going to be a disconnect. I mean, we know that there's no fish that will turn a ship to stone by touching it. We know that lions don't eat apes to cure a headache, and things like that. I think we know that, at least. People look at these and they're like, okay, well, this is just, archaic nonsense. But there's a lesson there. I think there's a lesson, especially with the fish story, because that's also magical contagion. But the thing is it helps get you in this kind of mindset to teach you how to think differently, that in a non-materialistic way, in a to kind of put yourself into a world that spirits are objectively real, as opposed to just figments of your imagination. And that, because that's the world that Agrippa lived in. And, one of the examples I always think about is like with astrology, that, some people will dismiss astrology automatically by saying, well, we now know that the earth isn't the center of the universe and blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, you look up at the sky, that's certainly what it looks like. And the astrological chart describes that. And when you're approaching magic from someone like Agrippa's point of view, you're doing it as a person who is having actually these real experiences. And this book, I think, does a really good job in helping you place that in a coherent way. So that's why I think it's important. Not that you have to agree with Agrippa on every point, because I certainly don't. But it helped me, at the very least, it helped me ask the right questions and get you started on a certain way of thinking and a certain line of inquiry. The question, the old question is, are the spirits real, or are they part of your mind? Well, the answer is both, right? And Agrippa helps you articulate that.
This has been another episode of the Arnemancy podcast. Thank you for joining me. I have been your host, Reverend Erik. You can find Arnemancy online at arnemancy.com, and you can subscribe to this podcast anywhere podcasts are found.
Hey, it's Heather Freeman again. I hope you enjoyed this excerpt from the Arnemancy podcast. You can listen to the rest of this series on Agrippa at arnemancy.com/Agrippa. Until the next time.